I'm Nora Caldwell, 30 years old, and the night my husband died, I stood in a hospital corridor with our 6-month-old twins tucked against my chest while the fluorescent lights hummed like a clock. I couldn't stop faces I knew slipping past me with quiet nods and quick exits, the kind people reserve for waiting rooms and bad news. I kept thinking someone in my family would take a stroller, a bag my hand, anything, and no one did. Lily fussed against my shoulder. Jack kicked in time with his sister's cry, and the hallway seemed to stretch into a tunnel of polished floors and closed doors. By the time I reached the parking lot, the air had turned cold, the kind that bites through a sweater and settles in your bones. I buckled the babies in with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking and whispered Daniel's name just to hear it out loud. I didn't know how to drive home and be someone's mother and someone's widow in the same breath. I only knew the night felt long and our apartment would be quiet in all the wrong places. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand up when no one offered a hand tap, that, like, and subscribe, so more stories like this find you. I grew up in a small town off I-65, the kind of place where the water tower wore the high school mascot, and everybody waved whether they knew you or not. My parents, Thomas and Marion, believed in early mornings clean counters and not making a fuss. Kindness was expected, but so was a stiff upper lip. I went to church on Sundays, learned to make a decent pot roast by 18, and told myself that steady was the safest kind of life. Daniel Pierce came along at a community fundraiser with a laugh that cut through the tinny microphone feedback and a patience that felt like shade on a July afternoon. We married 2 years later in the little white chapel where the windows stuck in the summer and the pews creaked when you stood. By 29, I had a part-time job balancing invoices for a farm supply store, and our savings were mostly envelopes in a kitchen drawer. We didn't have much, but we had enough, and I thought enough could carry a family if we held on tight. When the twins arrived early, the apartment shrank to the size of a nursery and a coffee pot. Lily liked rhythm car rides, the swing my heart beat, while Jack preferred a warm shoulder and the sound of Daniel's voice. We learned how to sleep in pieces, how to make a dollar stretch, how to smile at each other in the grocery aisle when one sale could cover a week. Then Daniel didn't come home from a job site, and the words the doctor used were simple and cruel: accident immediate, I'm sorry. People brought casseroles in foil and asked what I needed, a question so big it made me dizzy. I said diapers formula, a few hours of sleep, and they nodded. Eyes, shiny hands already reaching for their keys. The first night alone, I walked the hall with Lily while Jack cried in the crib, the floor cool under my bare feet, and I realized quiet could weigh more than any noise. I'd like to say the calls from family came the way rain does after a drought, steady and sure, but what I heard most was the echo of my own voice leaving messages. My mother sounded tired in a way that made me feel apologetic for asking. My father said I was strong and would figure it out because I always had. My sister sent a string of heart emojis that vanished on the screen as quickly as they appeared. Warren, my father-in-law, thanked me for the funeral program I mailed and then drifted into weather talk as if small talk could cover a fresh grave. I started measuring days by the number of bottles washed and the inches the laundry pile traveled up the chair back. Money tightened. Time thinned. The apartment began to smell like sour milk, no matter how often I scrubbed. I stopped watching the clock at night because it didn't help to know how long until morning if morning didn't bring relief. There's a way sorrow rearranges a room. It pushes the crib closer to the window so you can catch a breeze. It folds the stroller where the dining table should go. It leaves a stack of bills under a magnet shaped like a cow because there's nowhere else to put them. I learned to move quietly to rock 2 babies at once to lace my shoes, with one foot braced against a cabinet door. The economy of our life was measured in ounces and coupons, and the future felt like a hallway with all the lights off. I didn't tell anyone how the floor looked different at 3 a.m, or how sometimes I boiled water just to listen to it roar, because sound was proof I hadn't disappeared. When I prayed, I didn't ask for miracles. I asked for an hour, a ride, a warm meal. I didn't have to make the kind of help that doesn't need to be explained. The first crack in the silence was smaller than you'd think, a low rumble from the street tires easing to the curb headlights that cut a pale path across the blinds. Lily stirred and went still again. Jack slept on his side mouth soft, one hand splayed over the blanket like a starfish. I stood in the dark kitchen and watched the glow slide along the wall until it found the door. A knock sounded firm, measured the knock of someone who expects to be answered. I pressed my palm to the wood and felt the vibrations settle into my skin. And for the first time since the hospital corridor, I let myself imagine a voice on the other side that knew my name and meant it. I turned the deadbolt slowly, breath caught somewhere between hope and habit, and opened the door into the kind of night that changes everything. The door opened to the sight of my grandfather standing in the rain, his gray hair slicked back, a dark coat glistening beneath the porch light. Arthur Hale had always seemed larger than life, part legend, part warning, depending on who you asked. I hadn't seen him in nearly 8 years, not since my parents cut him out of their lives and told me he was cold and calculating. Yet there he stood holding an umbrella in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other, his expression unreadable. For a moment I just stared, unable to move or speak. The twins stirred in their crib behind me, their faint whimpers blending with the sound of rain tapping the window. "Grandpa," I managed to whisper, unsure if I was dreaming. He nodded once, his eyes sweeping over the cluttered living room, the piles of laundry, the bottles, the tiredness soaked into every corner. "Nora," he said quietly, his voice firm but kind, "you and those babies are coming with me tonight." His tone left no room for argument. I shook my head automatically. "You can't just show up, Mom and Dad." "Your parents have made their choices," he interrupted, setting his umbrella aside. "I'm making mine. You need help, and I'm here." He took a slow step forward, looking at Lily in her crib, then Jack. His gaze softened, and I saw something I hadn't expected understanding. He turned back to me and said, "I buried my wife when your mother was barely walking. I know what this kind of silence feels like, the kind that settles in after loss. I won't stand by and watch you drown in it." My throat tightened. "Grandpa, I don't want to be a burden." He gave a short laugh that wasn't unkind. "A burden, Nora? I own 6 homes and more cars than I can drive. You and 2 tiny children are not a burden. You're family." I hesitated, torn between pride and exhaustion. "But everyone hates you," I said softly. "They call you ruthless. Why now?" He sighed, the lines in his face deepening. "Because the people who judge me are the same ones who would leave you in this room to fall apart. That's all I need to know." Then, with a voice so gentle it almost broke me, he added, "Pack what matters. We're leaving." I didn't argue again. Within an hour, the twins were strapped into car seats in the back of a sleek black sedan that waited at the curb. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, and the city lights reflected off the wet pavement. I sat in the back seat holding Jack's hand while Lily slept with her head against my shoulder. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without my chest caving in. Grandpa sat across from me in the back of the car, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "From tonight on," he said, his voice steady, "you're not alone. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." I nodded silently, the hum of the tires on the road filling the space between us. When we turned through tall iron gates and the headlights washed over a massive stone house glowing in warm light, I felt like I'd crossed into another world. The mansion stood 3 stories high, its windows glimmering against the dark sky. As the car rolled to a stop, a man in a dark suit opened my door. "Welcome home, Miss Caldwell," he said politely. "I'm Victor. Mr. Hale asked me to prepare the nursery." I blinked at him, unsure what to say, and followed Grandpa inside. The entryway smelled faintly of lemon and wood polish. The floors gleamed under the chandelier's light. A woman with graying hair and kind eyes appeared from the hallway, wiping her hands on an apron. "I'm Alma," she said with a soft smile. "We've been expecting you." I didn't understand what she meant until she led me upstairs. The nursery was already waiting, 2 matching cribs, fresh sheets, rows of folded blankets, shelves stocked with formula wipes and diapers. There was even a rocking chair by the window. I stood frozen at the door, one hand on the frame. "How did you—" Grandpa's voice came from behind me. "When I said you were coming home, I meant it tonight." I made a few calls. As I tucked the twins into their new cribs, something inside me loosened. The soft rise and fall of their breathing was the only sound in the room. I sat in the rocking chair and watched the rain trickle down the glass until my eyes blurred. For the first time since Daniel's accident, the world didn't feel completely against me. The next morning, sunlight streamed through tall windows, touching every surface of the guest room in a warm glow. I found Grandpa in the dining room reading a newspaper, a cup of coffee steaming beside his plate. "Sit," he said without looking up. "Eat. You'll need strength." I hesitated at the threshold. "I don't know how to thank you," I murmured. "Don't," he replied flatly, folding the paper. "Just promise me one thing. Learn." "Learn?" I asked. He met my eyes. "Not just how to survive. You've done enough of that. I want you to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet again, to grow for yourself and those children." His words caught me off guard. "I don't have a degree in business," I said quietly. "I don't even know where to start." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You'll start with me. You're a Hale whether the rest of them like it or not." That afternoon, he drove us to the downtown office tower that bore his name. From the outside, it looked intimidating, steel and glass, everything moving fast and sharp. Inside, I clutched the diaper bag like armor, while people in suits passed us with polite nods. Grandpa led me into a conference room where a dozen executives waited. "This is my granddaughter, Nora," he announced without ceremony. "She's sitting in from now on." I sat through that first meeting barely breathing. The words bounced around the room, assets, revenue projections, foreign languages wrapped in confidence. When I looked lost, Grandpa would tap his pen lightly on the table, a quiet signal to focus. It was his way of saying, "You belong here, even if you don't see it yet." Every night after the twins fell asleep, we'd meet in his study. He'd slide a stack of papers toward me and say, "Tell me what you see." At first, all I saw were rows of numbers that made no sense. "Then keep looking," he'd say. "You'll understand soon enough." Some nights, exhaustion got the better of me. I'd rest my head on the table and whisper, "I can't do this, Grandpa. Maybe I'm not built for this world." He'd pause, remove his glasses, and answer with quiet conviction. "You buried your husband, carried 2 infants through grief, and faced every closed door alone. Don't tell me you're not strong enough. You already are." His belief carried a weight that forced me to sit up straighter to keep trying even when the words blurred. Weeks passed, and I began to see patterns where there had only been chaos. Profit and loss no longer looked like puzzles meant to defeat me. When I hesitated in meetings, Grandpa would nudge me. "Speak," he'd say, "even if you're wrong." I learned that failure didn't end a lesson, it deepened it. Late one night after he'd gone to bed, I sat in the nursery watching Lily gnaw on a teething ring and Jack roll onto his side. A thought began to take shape, small but bright. When Daniel was sick, I'd struggled to find baby products that didn't irritate the twins' skin or cost a fortune. What if other mothers felt the same? What if I could make something better? I wrote down the words "Little Haven" on a scrap of paper. I didn't know then that those 2 words would change everything. When I showed the note to Grandpa the next morning, he studied it for a moment, then smiled faintly. That, he said, tapping the page isn't survival, that's building. And for the first time in a long while, I believed him. The days began to blend together, early mornings with the twins, afternoons at Arthur's company, and long nights bent over spreadsheets at his study desk. There were moments when I'd rock Lily to sleep with one arm while balancing a report on my lap, the words swimming until I forced them to stay still. Arthur was patient but relentless. If I misunderstood a calculation, he didn't correct me right away. He'd ask, "What's the pattern?" until I found it myself. His confidence in me became both a challenge and a lifeline. Some evenings I'd catch him in the nursery adjusting the twins' blankets after they'd already fallen asleep. His large hand would linger on the edge of the crib, the same hand that used to sign contracts worth millions, now brushing a curl from Lily's forehead. It was in those quiet moments that the house, so grand and echoing, began to feel less like a stranger's home and more like shelter. Still exhaustion settled into my bones. Between the feedings meetings and lessons, sleep became a luxury. I'd fall asleep at the desk sometimes, forehead pressed against ledgers. When I'd wake, a folded blanket would be draped across my shoulders. Arthur never mentioned it. He just expected me back at breakfast, ready to keep learning. A few months in, he handed me a stack of papers one night and said, "You've been looking at numbers. Now look at people. Business isn't only math, it's motive. Find out what people need. That simple instruction changed how I saw everything. The idea for Little Haven grew out of that. I remembered those first months alone after Daniel's accident, how hard it was to find products that didn't irritate the twins' skin or cost half my grocery budget. I started researching suppliers, learning what went into every item on the shelves. The thought kept me awake at night. What if other parents were struggling the same way? What if I could make something better, safer, kinder? When I showed the notes to Arthur, he didn't dismiss them. He read each page slowly, the corner of his mouth lifting. This, he said finally, isn't survival. This is creation. Build it. That was how it started. I set up a small workspace in one of the unused rooms, upstairs boxes of samples stacked beside the crib. Alma brought me tea when she saw the light still on after midnight. "You remind me of him," she said once, nodding toward Arthur's study. "He used to burn through nights the same way. Finding a supplier was harder than I expected. Most companies dismissed me before the conversation began. We don't deal with startups," one told me, especially not home-based ones. Then came a man named Mark Kent, who agreed to meet in person. He ran a modest factory 2 hours outside Lexington. The morning of the meeting, I left the twins with Alma and drove through a stretch of farmland still wet with dew. My palms were slick on the steering wheel. The building was plain metal siding and old sign, but when I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and soap. Mark sat behind a wide desk, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He greeted me with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're very young, Mrs. Pierce," he said after glancing at my proposal. "And frankly, I don't see much experience here. Why should I trust you with my inventory?" The words stung, but Arthur's voice echoed in my head. "Speak, even if you're wrong." I leaned forward, keeping my hand steady. "Because I've already survived worse," I said quietly. "I buried my husband. I raised twins when I had nothing and no one to help. If I can survive that, I can build this." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Mark nodded once, a flicker of respect breaking through his skepticism. "All right, we'll start small." It wasn't a promise, but it was a chance. The next weeks were chaos. I drove back and forth between the house and the factory, balancing feedings, phone calls, and late-night emails. Orders came in slowly at first. 1, then 3, then 10. I shipped each one myself, wrapping every box like it was a gift. Alma helped tape labels while Lily babbled on the floor beside her. Arthur stayed out of the logistics, but he kept watch in his own way. "Numbers first, pride later," he'd remind me. "You can't fix what you don't measure." I learned to track every cent. Mistakes were costly, and I made plenty, but with each one came a little more confidence. There were nights when I sat in the nursery, surrounded by half-finished products, feeling the familiar pull of exhaustion. Jack would start to cry, Lily would follow, and I'd wonder if I was trying to build something too big for one person. But then I'd hear Arthur's cane tapping down the hall, slow and steady, and I'd know I wasn't alone. By the time the twins turned 1, Little Haven had its first 1,000 orders. The number felt unreal. I ran to Arthur's study, holding my phone out. "We did it," I said, breathless. He looked up from his book, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Congratulations," he said. "Now do it 10,000 times more." I laughed, shaking my head. "You never let me rest." "Rest when there's nothing left to build," he said simply. That was his way: celebration, brief purpose, constant. Not long after, I stood in the nursery watching the twins nap in matching pajamas printed with tiny stars. I thought about how far we'd come from the tiny apartment that smelled of sour formula to this house filled with light and noise and second chances. Little Haven had become more than a company. It was a piece of the life I'd thought was lost, rebuilt from the ground up. But quiet success has a way of drawing attention. As the weeks went on, word spread. The local paper ran a small piece about the young mother turning grief into growth. Orders doubled. Then came interviews, photo requests, partnerships. Arthur kept reminding me to move carefully. "Growth invites noise," he said. "Don't let it drown out your purpose." I tried to listen, but the noise grew louder. My phone filled with messages, reporters, potential investors, even distant acquaintances. And then one evening, an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. When I answered, a familiar voice said, "Nora, it's your mother." For a second, I didn't speak. The sound of her voice took me back to that day outside the hospital, the way she had turned away. "Mom," I said slowly, "I saw your story in the paper." She went on, her tone bright and practiced. "You've done so well, honey. We miss you and the babies. Why don't you bring them by?" I stared at the phone at the twins' toys scattered across the carpet. "You told me to handle it," I said quietly. "When I asked for help, you said you couldn't." There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, that was a difficult time for everyone. We were grieving, too. Surely you understand." I ended the call without answering. For a long while, I just sat there listening to the steady tick of the clock and the faint sound of the twins breathing through the monitor. The past had found its way back polite and smiling, but I wasn't sure what it wanted yet. That night, as I tucked the twins into bed, I looked out the window toward the long drive that curved away from the house. Headlights appeared in the distance before fading into the trees. For the first time, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. The quiet wouldn't last. A week after my mother's call, a white envelope arrived with gold edges and a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from Warren Pierce, my father-in-law. The handwriting was neat and formal, his tone suddenly warm, as if the man who'd once shut the door in my face had been replaced by someone entirely new. He congratulated me on the success of Little Haven and wrote that family bonds deserve renewal. Then, on the second page, came the suggestion merging my small business with his family's company to ensure the legacy of Daniel Pierce lives on. I read it twice, then a third time, until the words blurred into nothing but noise. When I showed the letter to Arthur that evening, he didn't seem surprised. He set it beside his whiskey glass, adjusted his cufflinks, and said quietly, "It begins." I frowned, unsure what he meant. "They've noticed your light, Nora," he said. "And the kind of people who once ignored a spark will always come running when they see a fire." His voice carried no anger, only certainty, like someone who'd seen this pattern too many times before. That night, after the twins were asleep, I sat at my desk with the letter in front of me. I thought of Warren's face the day he told me there was no bond left between us, how his eyes avoided mine as he closed the door. I remembered the hours I'd spent outside pharmacies trying to stretch one can of formula into two, and the silence that followed every unanswered call. The memory stung, but it no longer held power. I folded the letter neatly, slipped it back into its envelope, and placed it in the bottom drawer. A few days later, I found Arthur in the sunroom reading the morning paper. The light coming through the windows made his silver hair glow almost white. "What would you do?" I asked him, handing him my coffee. He didn't look up from the page. "You already did it," he said. "You ignored them." I sat across from him, feeling the weight of those words settle. "You think they'll stop?" He folded the paper, finally meeting my eyes. "No. But that's not your problem anymore. Strength attracts noise. Let them make theirs." For a while, I believed he was right. Orders continued to grow, and so did the noise. Little Haven appeared in 2 parenting magazines. A local television station asked for an interview, which I turned down, afraid of attention that might twist the story into something it wasn't. Even so, the attention brought back faces I hadn't seen in years. Old classmates sent congratulations. Strangers mailed handwritten notes. And then one Saturday morning, Victor came into the kitchen holding the house phone. "Miss Nora, he said there's a woman at the gate asking for you. Says her name is Jenna." The mug nearly slipped from my hand. My sister's name felt strange in his mouth. I hadn't seen her since Daniel's funeral. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, and the long drive shimmered under the early sun. A silver sedan idled by the gate. Jenna stood beside it in a pale coat, her hair pulled back, sunglasses hiding her eyes. In her hands, she held a box wrapped in ribbon. "Nora," she called, her voice bright, almost rehearsed. "You look amazing. I can't believe how beautiful this place is." She took a step forward, arms opening as if we were meeting after a long vacation. I stayed where I was. "What are you doing here, Jenna?" I asked. Her smile faltered. "I just wanted to see you, to make things right." She lifted the box slightly. "I brought something for the kids." Before I could answer, Arthur's cane struck the gravel behind me. He moved slower these days, but when he appeared beside me, the air around him changed. "You must be the sister," he said evenly. Jenna's face paled. "Mr. Hale." "I save it," he said, his voice calm but sharp. Family doesn't walk away and knock only when fortune answers. Jenna blinked fast, her lips trembling. "You can't keep her from us," she said, her voice rising. I took a step forward, my pulse quick but steady. "He's not keeping me from anyone, Jenna. You lost me the day you turned away." She stared at me speechless before setting the box down on the ground and retreating to her car. Gravel crunched under her tires as she sped away. I stood there for a long time watching the gate close again, feeling a strange quiet settle over me. Arthur rested a hand on my shoulder. "You're learning," he said softly. "Love isn't proven in sunshine, Nora. It's proven in the dark." I nodded, unable to speak. His words stayed with me the rest of the day. By evening, the calm began to unravel. A news alert flashed on my phone. Another article, this one larger than before, titled "From Widow to CEO, The Story Behind Little Haven's Rise." The piece was fair, but it spread quickly. Messages poured in again, and among them were names I wished I'd forgotten. My mother's number appeared twice that night. I didn't answer. The next day, I found a message from Thomas instead, short and deliberate. "We need to talk. It's important." Arthur saw me reading it at breakfast. "They'll try again," he said, not looking up from his coffee. "This time, they'll come in person." He was right. The next afternoon, Victor came into the study, his usually calm face drawn tight. "There's a crowd at the gate," he said. "Your parents, your sister, and Mr. Pierce. They have papers. They're demanding to speak with you." Arthur stood, setting his cane aside with care. "Let them in," he said quietly. Then he turned to me. "But remember, Nora, this is your fight, not mine." The heavy doors opened and the house filled with the sound of voices too sweet, too loud. Marion was first through the foyer, her perfume sharp and familiar. Thomas followed his expression, set. Jenna lingered behind them, her eyes darting to every corner of the room. Warren Pierce came last, carrying a leather folder so thick it looked like armor. "Nora," my mother said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "you look wonderful. And this home so lovely." I folded my arms. "What do you want?" Warren stepped forward, laying the folder on the table. "Rights," he said simply. "As Daniel's father, I have claims over his share of this empire. You, as his widow, have a duty to share with his bloodline." I laughed, a sound that didn't feel like mine. "Duty. When I begged you for help, you shut the door in my face. Now you talk about duty." He straightened. "That was the past. Business is business." I turned to my father. "And you? Why are you here?" Thomas raised his hands as if to calm me. "Nora, please. We're family. We can make this work for everyone. Think of your children's future." My pulse pounded in my ears. "Their future doesn't depend on any of you. It depends on me." Jenna's voice cut through the room, sharp and shaky. "You're selfish, Nora. We all suffered too. You're just shutting us out now that you're comfortable." The words hit like stones, but something inside me stayed firm. "Selfish," I said quietly. "I begged you to stay with me the night Daniel died. You said you couldn't handle crying babies. Now you want a piece of what I built alone." Her face flushed. Thomas stepped closer, his tone cold. "You wouldn't have survived without your grandfather. Don't fool yourself into thinking this is all yours." For a split second, doubt flickered. But then I saw Arthur standing silently near the doorway, his gaze steady, proud. Lily's laughter echoed faintly from upstairs, and the sound anchored me. "You're right," I said. "I wouldn't have survived without him. He opened his door when you slammed yours. He gave me a chance when you gave me nothing. But everything since the sleepless nights, the risks, the work that's mine. And you'll never touch it." Warren slammed his fist on the table. "We'll take this to court." "Do it," I said, meeting his glare. "I have every contract, every receipt. Go ahead, but you'll lose." The room fell silent. My mother's painted smile faltered. Thomas muttered something about regret. Jenna's eyes glistened. "You'll see what it feels like to be alone," she whispered. I took a deep breath. I already have, and I survived. Arthur's cane struck the marble, once echoing like thunder. "You heard her," he said quietly. "Leave my house. Don't come back." The sound of the doors closing behind them was louder than the argument had been. I stood in the quiet foyer, my hands shaking, tears threatening but not falling. Lily's soft cry came from upstairs, and I turned toward it, steady again. Arthur approached, his voice low. "You fought well tonight." I was terrified, I admitted. He gave a small smile. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Nora. It's standing up anyway." I nodded, wiping my face. For the first time, the fear that had followed me since the hospital felt smaller. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Inside, the air was still, but something in me had shifted. The part that once begged for love had finally learned how to close a door. The storm outside the night they left had carried into morning. The house was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. It wasn't grief anymore. It was aftermath. I moved through the hallways as though the air itself had changed weight. The echo of their voices still lingered, but underneath it was something steadier relief. I made tea and carried it to the study, where Arthur sat by the window reading. His cane leaned against the armrest, and beside him was the folder Warren had tried to claim as his own. "They'll try something else," I said. "They won't stop at words." Arthur didn't look up. "Then we make sure they can't." He turned a page slowly, his tone calm, almost casual. "You need someone who understands the law. I know a woman sharp, discreet, and not easily intimidated." He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed. "That was how I met Diane Merrill. She arrived 2 days later, brisk and unshaken, a woman whose presence filled a room before her voice did. Her gray suit was plain, but her eyes missed nothing. She laid her folder on the table and said simply, 'Tell me everything from the beginning.' For 2 hours, I did every payment, every contract, every late night spent building Little Haven." She listened without interruption, only nodding now and then, her pen moving steadily across the page. When I finished, she closed the folder and said, "You've done more groundwork than most people twice your age. The company's yours. They can't touch it unless you give them a reason." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "So we're safe?" I asked. She gave a small smile. "Safer than you were last week. But keep everything documented. The louder you rise, the more proof you need to stand on." Arthur approved of her immediately. After she left, he said, "Good choice. A woman who knows when to listen and when to strike." He handed me another stack of papers, new filings, insurance forms, contracts to update. "You'll sign these yourself. No one else." That's how independence begins. Over the next few months, I learned what protection really meant. Not just against family who came with open hands, but against the fear that they might someday win. Diane taught me how to read fine print, how to claim ownership without apology. I began to see Little Haven not as a fragile creation, but as something solid, something I could defend. The twins were growing fast. Lily had started walking first, unsteady, but fearless. Jack followed, more cautious, always checking if I was watching before he tried again. Alma joked that they were mirrors of Arthur and me, one bold, one deliberate. I liked the comparison. The mansion no longer felt like borrowed space. It felt like ours. Orders from Little Haven continued to grow, and with each milestone came another test of strength. I received letters from investors offering to help expand the company, their words wrapped in flattery. But Arthur's advice stayed clear in my mind: build slow, build strong. I declined every offer. Instead, I focused on refining our products, safer formulas, simpler packaging, and personal notes included in every shipment. The mothers who wrote back weren't customers to me. They were voices from the same struggle I'd known. Sometimes late at night, I'd find Arthur in the living room watching the twins play on the rug. "You remind me of your grandmother," he said once. "She had your quiet fire." His voice was soft, almost distant. She used to say, "Family isn't who gives you life, it's who helps you live it." He looked at me then, eyes tired but proud. "You've proved her right." Spring came, and with it a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The legal storm had passed, and Little Haven was thriving. I began taking the twins to the park every Sunday. The sound of their laughter in the open air felt like healing. Arthur would come along sometimes, sitting on a bench with Victor nearby, watching with a faint smile as Jack climbed the slide and Lily collected pebbles for him to hold. One evening, as I tucked the twins into bed, I found a small envelope on my pillow. Inside was a check, more money than I'd seen on paper at once, and a short note in Arthur's careful handwriting: "For the future of Little Haven. Use it wisely." My throat tightened. When I found him downstairs, he didn't look up from his book. "It's not a gift," he said. It's a loan. Pay it back in legacy." I understood what he meant. With his blessing, I opened a new branch office in Lexington, a small space but entirely mine. I hired 3 employees, all mothers like me, and Diane helped draft fair contracts that gave them flexible hours and paid leave. Watching them settle into the work felt like a full-circle moment, giving others the support I once begged for. Still, success brought reminders of the past in unexpected ways. A letter arrived one morning postmarked from my hometown. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. Inside was a short note from my father. "Your mother isn't well. She asks for you." The words were simple, but the years between us made them heavy. I carried the letter to Arthur's study. He read it once, then handed it back. "You don't owe them a thing," he said quietly, "but forgiveness doesn't mean returning. It means releasing." I didn't answer. That night I stood by the window long after the lights went out downstairs. I thought about my parents, about the silence that had once crushed me, and how different it felt now. I realized forgiveness wasn't for them, it was for me. A week later, I sent a small bouquet of lilies to their address with a note. "I wish you peace." No return address, no explanation. It felt enough. As summer approached, Little Haven reached its first major milestone, 10,000 orders shipped. I hosted a small gathering at the mansion for the staff, Arthur, and a few close partners. Alma decorated the terrace with white lights, and the twins toddled between tables laughing as Victor served lemonade. When I raised a glass to thank everyone, my hands trembled not from fear, but gratitude. Arthur stood beside me, his hand steady on my shoulder. To Nora, he said, his voice strong, even against the hum of conversation, "For turning loss into legacy." The group applauded, and I caught Diane's approving nod from across the table. Later, after the guests left and the twins were asleep, I found Arthur in the garden looking up at the night sky. "You did it," I said quietly. He smiled faintly. "No," he said, "we did." The soft light from the house caught the lines on his face, the years of both battle and endurance etched into them. "The hardest part is over," he said almost to himself. But I saw something in his expression that unsettled me, fatigue deeper than usual, a weariness that lingered behind his smile. He noticed me watching and straightened his shoulders. "Don't look at me like that," he said gently. "I'm not leaving yet." I forced a smile, but the truth settled somewhere deep inside. The man who had lifted me from ruin was growing older, and the time ahead would test me in ways I hadn't yet imagined. That night, as the house fell quiet, and the soft hum of the nursery monitor filled the hall, I realized that strength wasn't a moment, it was a rhythm, and soon it would be my turn to carry it forward. The change began quietly, almost too gently to notice. At first, Arthur brushed it off, how he'd pause halfway up the staircase or take longer to find the right word in conversation. "Just the price of age," he said when I offered to call the doctor. But within weeks, the small pauses grew longer, the fatigue deeper. One evening at dinner, his fork slipped from his hand, clattering against the plate. He chuckled it away, but I saw the tremor. It was the first time I'd seen him look unsure of his own body. 2 days later, I called Dr. Elliot Rowe, the physician who'd been with our family for decades. He arrived that afternoon, the same calm presence I remembered from childhood visits. "He'll hate this," I warned as we waited in the foyer. "Good," Dr. Rowe said with a faint smile. "Means he's still himself." Arthur didn't protest the examination, but his impatience filled the room. Afterward, when Dr. Rowe stepped into the hallway with me, his expression was careful. "His heart's weaker than he admits," he said quietly. "He's stable now, but he'll need rest and less stress. I can adjust his medication, but you'll have to keep an eye on him." I knotted my throat tight. "He'll never agree to rest." The doctor sighed. "Then make it seem like his idea." That evening, I found Arthur in his study, staring out the window at the fading light. "You spoke with Elliot," he said without turning. "He's fussing again, isn't he?" I crossed the room and sat opposite him. "He's worried, that's all." Arthur's eyes stayed on the horizon. "People mistake worry for love, Nora. They're not always the same." For a moment, the room felt smaller than usual, the shelves closing in around us. "You've spent your life building things," I said. "Maybe it's time to let them stand on their own." He glanced at me, then his gaze sharp but softening. "That's exactly what I've been doing." He folded his hands on the desk. "You think I don't know what's coming? I've been preparing you for it since the day I knocked on your door." His words stayed with me long after I left the room. For the first time, I understood that every lesson, every hard push toward independence had been his way of handing me the reins. Over the next few months, his energy ebbed and flowed. Some mornings he was his old self again, reviewing reports, correcting my numbers, laughing with the twins as they climbed into his lap. Other days he'd disappear into his study for hours, too tired to speak. Victor began handling more of his correspondence, and Alma fussed in quiet ways. Stronger tea, warmer sweaters, subtle signs of care Arthur pretended not to notice. Meanwhile, Little Haven was entering a new stage. Orders had expanded beyond Kentucky, and a regional distributor offered to carry our full line. It should have been a moment of celebration, but every success felt bittersweet. I'd bring the updates to Arthur, expecting his usual spark of advice, yet he only smiled faintly. "You don't need my approval anymore," he said once. "That's how I know you're ready." In late autumn, he collapsed in the garden. It was a crisp morning, the kind he loved, and I found him kneeling among the rose bushes, his hand pressed to his chest. For heartbeat, time stopped. I shouted for Victor, and between us we got him inside before the ambulance arrived. Dr. Rowe was already waiting when we reached the hospital. The hours that followed blurred together the sterile white walls, the steady rhythm of machines, the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to everything. When Dr. Rowe finally stepped out of Arthur's room, I could read the truth in his eyes before he spoke. "He'll recover," he said, "but his heart won't take another episode like this. You'll need to start making decisions on his behalf." When I walked into the room, Arthur looked smaller somehow, the sharpness in his face softened by fatigue. "You should be at work," he said. "The world doesn't stop for an old man." I sat beside him, taking his hand. "The world can wait a day." He squeezed my fingers weakly. "Don't you dare start pitying me." "I'm not," I said. "I'm thanking you." His eyes flickered with confusion. "For what? For showing up when no one else did?" He looked at me for a long moment, then closed his eyes. "Don't thank me for that. Thank yourself for opening the door." He was discharged a week later, but nothing was the same. The man who once commanded rooms now needed help crossing them. Yet he never let anyone see the struggle, not even the twins who still saw him as indestructible. When he couldn't join us on our walks, he'd sit by the window watching as they chased each other through the yard, their laughter rising through the glass. One night after the children were asleep, he called me to his study. A single envelope lay on the desk between us. "It's my will," he said. "Everything's in order. The house, the accounts, the companies. But more than that, I'm leaving you my name." I shook my head quickly. "Arthur, don't." He lifted a hand to stop me. "Listen, I built an empire with it, but names mean nothing unless they're carried with purpose. You've already done that. I just want you to promise one thing. Don't let the family name ever stand for greed again." I promised him. By winter, he began sleeping more, the hours of wakefulness shrinking each week. I managed Little Haven alone now with Diane's steady counsel and Mark's practical help. There were days when I'd walk past his closed study door and still half expect to hear his voice. The silence had weight to it, but not the emptiness it once carried. Then one morning in February, Victor found me in the nursery. His expression said everything. "He's gone," he whispered. The words seemed to hang in the air, still and quiet, as if even the house refused to breathe. The funeral was small, just the people he'd chosen in life. No reporters, no extended relatives, only those who had known his heart beyond his fortune. The twins stood beside me, clutching my hands, too young to understand the finality of it all, but old enough to feel the heaviness around them. When the last prayer ended and the crowd began to thin, I stayed by his casket. The winter light slanted through the stained glass, turning the room gold. "You kept your promise," I whispered. "Now it's my turn." That evening, back at the mansion, I found his desk exactly as he'd left it. A note rested atop a stack of business papers in his familiar handwriting. "For Nora, because love is the only empire worth building." Beneath it lay a key and a sealed envelope addressed to me. Inside were documents transferring ownership of his foundation, along with a handwritten line, "Build something that lasts longer than wealth." I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. The house around me silent, except for the faint hum of the nursery monitor upstairs. His absence filled every corner, yet somehow it didn't feel like loss. It felt like inheritance, not of money, but of purpose. Later that night, I stood at the window watching snow drift across the dark lawn. Lily stirred in her crib, murmuring softly, and Jack's hand reached across to touch hers. I smiled through tears. Arthur's voice echoed in my mind, steady, firm, unwavering. "You're ready." And for the first time, I knew he was right. The weeks after Arthur's funeral moved in slow waves. The house felt different without the echo of his cane or the sound of his voice calling for Victor down the hall. Every morning I'd still pause by his study, half expecting to hear him inside. Instead, there was only the steady tick of the old clock on the mantel, the one he wound every night without fail. The silence wasn't empty, it carried him in its own quiet way. The twins adjusted faster than I did. Lily began drawing pictures of the big house with Arthur in the window, always smiling. Jack, ever the quiet one, started placing a small toy car on Arthur's armchair before bedtime. "So he doesn't get bored," he explained once. Their innocence kept me steady. It reminded me that grief didn't have to mean ending, it could mean carrying forward. One morning I stood in the garden where Arthur used to prune his roses. The winter had stripped the branches bare, but beneath the frost buds still clung to life. I could almost hear him saying, "Build something that lasts longer than wealth." Those words became my compass. That night I reopened the envelope he'd left behind. Inside were not only the foundation papers, but a list of names, contacts, charities, and causes Arthur had once supported. At the top, in bold handwriting, he had written, "Begin with Ethan's name." I didn't need to think twice. Ethan Pierce had been the man who believed in me before I believed in myself, the father my children would never know. I decided to create something that would carry both men's legacies, a foundation dedicated to helping single parents rebuild their lives, just as Arthur had helped me. The Ethan Hale Foundation launched 6 months later in a modest downtown office. Diane guided me through every legal step, while Mark helped design the logistics for grants and partnerships. The mission was simple housing assistance, job training, and emergency childcare support for single mothers and fathers. I poured myself into the work, often late into the night, fueled by the same drive Arthur once demanded from me. The opening ceremony was small but beautiful. The twins stood beside me in their little navy coats as we cut the ribbon. Reporters asked questions, cameras flashed, but all I saw were the faces in the crowd, parents holding their children, volunteers ready to help, and people who reminded me of the person I'd once been, lost, scared, and just hoping for a door to open. That evening, as the last guests left, I sat in the empty hall surrounded by balloons and folded chairs. Victor appeared with 2 mugs of tea and said softly, "He'd be proud, you know." I smiled, watching the twins chase each other between the tables. I hope so. The weeks that followed were a blur of work and progress. Little Haven grew alongside the foundation, and soon we began collaborating with hospitals and shelters. Every success felt like a quiet conversation with Arthur, one I carried on in his absence. The story caught attention quickly. A local magazine featured a profile titled, "From Widow to Builder, How Nora Caldwell Turns Loss into Hope." Then came larger publications, interviews, and speaking invitations. When a call came from New York inviting me to speak at an entrepreneurship conference, I hesitated. Public speaking had never been something I enjoyed, but Diane insisted. "You're ready," she said, "and stories like yours matter." A week later, I stood on a stage under bright lights looking out over a sea of faces. My hands trembled as I adjusted the microphone. In the front row, Lily and Jack waved beside Victor, their smiles grounding me. I began simply telling them about the night I lost everything, how a knock on the door changed my life, and how one act of compassion became the cornerstone of everything I'd built. As I spoke about Arthur and Ethan, about loss and rebuilding, I saw people nodding, some wiping their eyes. When I finished, the applause felt less like noise and more like affirmation. I looked toward the front row and saw Victor's quiet pride, the twins' excitement, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe I'd stepped fully into the role Arthur had prepared me for. Afterward, a man approached me backstage. "Ms. Caldwell," he said, extending a card. "Our organization works with widowed parents nationwide. I'd like to discuss a partnership." His words felt like another door opening. By the end of that week, the Ethan Hale Foundation had secured its first national collaboration. In the middle of all this progress, a letter arrived at the office, handwritten, no return address. The penmanship was familiar. "My mother, we read about you in the paper. You've made something beautiful. Your father and I would like to visit. We miss the children." I read the letter twice and set it aside. The woman who once turned away was now asking to step back in. That evening I found myself walking the length of Arthur's study again. His chair sat facing the window where he'd loved to watch the light fade over the lawn. I imagined what he would have said, something firm but kind, reminding me that forgiveness was mine to give, not theirs to demand. A few days later, I replied with a short note, "Thank you for the kind words. We're doing well. I wish you peace." I didn't invite them. Some doors could close gently without anger, just understanding. The foundation continued to grow. Our programs reached more families each month, and the twins started visiting the office after school, greeting volunteers and packing care boxes. Lily liked handing out blankets while Jack insisted on inspecting every donation list. Watching them there, I saw both Ethan's gentleness and Arthur's determination reflected in their small faces. That spring, a television station invited me to speak about the foundation's work. The segment aired on a Sunday morning, and by that afternoon, messages flooded our inbox offers to donate, volunteer, and share their stories. One woman wrote, "I lost my husband last year. Seeing you gives me hope that I can rebuild too." I printed her message and pinned it to the office wall, a quiet reminder of why I'd started. Months later, the Lexington Herald ran another headline, "Widow builds 2 empires, one for babies, one for families." The photo showed me sitting with Lily and Jack in the garden. Arthur had once tended the roses blooming behind us again. When I brought the paper to his grave that weekend, I laid it beside the flowers and whispered, "We did it." The wind rustled through the trees carrying the scent of roses, and I felt something lift, a lightness I hadn't known since the day he found me at that broken apartment door. By summer, the Ethan Hale Foundation hosted its first gala. The ballroom shimmered under soft lights, and families from across the country came to share their stories. I spoke last that night standing beneath a banner that read, "Love builds what loss cannot destroy." As I looked across the crowd, mothers, fathers, children, and volunteers, I realized this was the justice Arthur had wanted, not revenge or recognition, but redemption through compassion. When the applause faded, Lily ran to the stage, Jack right behind her. She tugged on my dress and asked Mom, "Do you think Grandpa can see us tonight?" I smiled and knelt beside her. "Yes, sweetheart, he's right here." The room fell quiet for a moment, and I felt a warmth spread through me that no spotlight could match. That night, as the twins slept and the house settled into silence, I walked into the garden once more. The roses swayed under the moonlight, their petals heavy with dew. I thought about everything Arthur had taught me, how to stand alone, how to give without fear, how to build something lasting. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to his wealth, but a living symbol of his faith in me. The wind moved softly through the branches, and in that stillness I whispered, "You were right, Grandpa. We're ready." The years passed more gently than I expected. The twins grew into bright, curious children who carried pieces of every person who'd helped shape us. Lily had Arthur's quiet confidence. Jack carried Ethan's steady kindness. The mansion, once filled with echoes of loss, had become a home again, alive with laughter, footsteps, and the smell of Sunday pancakes. The roses in Arthur's garden bloomed stronger each year, like they knew he was still keeping watch. On a crisp autumn afternoon, when the leaves along the drive turned gold and red, I told the twins we were going to visit their father. They didn't ask why. They just nodded as if they already knew it was time. We drove through the hills outside Lexington, the kind of countryside Daniel used to love, open sky, rolling fields, and silence deep enough to think. In the back seat, Lily traced shapes on the fogged window while Jack hummed softly, holding a small bouquet of white lilies he'd picked himself that morning. The cemetery sat beneath a canopy of oak trees, their branches heavy with color. I parked beside the gate, and the three of us walked the narrow path until the headstone came into view. Daniel Pierce, beloved husband and father. The stone had aged, but the words still felt new. Jack knelt first, setting the flowers at its base. "Hi, Dad," he said quietly. Lily crouched beside him, her hand brushing the carved letters. "We brought the flowers. Mom likes," she whispered. I stood behind them, the wind catching strands of my hair, carrying the scent of the roses we'd left behind at home. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I thought about the night everything fell apart, the hospital hallway, the cold apartment, the silence of phones that never rang. I thought about the knock that had changed everything, and the man who'd refused to let me disappear. "You'd be proud of them," I said softly. "They're everything we dreamed of." The twins looked up, waiting. I smiled through tears. And Grandpa's proud too. He's watching over all of us. Jack took my hand. "Mom," he asked, "what's family really? Is it people who are gone too?" I knelt beside him, the autumn light washing across the grass. "Family," I said, "isn't just who shares your name or your blood. It's the ones who show up, who love you when it's hard, who help you stand when you fall. Even when they're gone, they stay with you in who you become." Lily leaned against me, her voice barely above a whisper. "So Grandpa's still family?" I nodded. "Always. He's here in us, in every kind thing we do, in every choice we make, to build instead of break." The wind moved through the trees again, scattering leaves across the ground like small blessings. We stayed until the sun began to sink behind the hills, the sky painted in shades of amber and rose. As we walked back to the car, Jack slipped his hand into mine, and Lily took the other. Behind us, the last light caught on the polished stone, making it glow softly in the distance. I turned once more, not in grief, but in gratitude. Every trial, every closed door, every person who'd turned away had led us here to this peace, this strength, this family we'd built from the ground up. That evening we stopped by the mansion gates before going inside. Arthur's bronze nameplate gleamed faintly in the fading light. I rested my hand on the cool metal and whispered, "You were right. We're standing on our own now." The twins each kissed their fingers and touched the gate, their small faces solemn but bright. Then we walked inside together, the house glowing warm against the twilight. Later, after they'd fallen asleep, I sat in the quiet study where Arthur's desk still stood. His chair faced the window the same way he'd left it. On the corner sat his favorite fountain pen, a single sheet of paper beneath it. I'd never moved it, never needed to. It felt like a reminder that building a legacy isn't about grand gestures. It's about the everyday choices that keep love alive long after we're gone. Outside, the night settled over the garden, the roses swaying gently in the breeze. I thought of Ethan's laughter, Arthur's voice, and every person who had once stood beside me. They were all still here, woven into every corner of the life we'd made. I smiled, letting the stillness wrap around me. If you've ever had to start over to rebuild from the pieces someone else left behind, I hope you remember this. You're not defined by who walked away, but by what you choose to build in their absence. Love, when it's real, doesn't vanish. It roots itself deep and keeps blooming even through the hardest winters. And before you go, take a moment to think about the people who showed up when it mattered most. Tell them thank you. Hold them close. And if this story found you at the right time, I hope you'll stay a while. There are more stories of strength and second chances waiting for you here.